Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We will now be having our final panel discussion for the day, entitled The Holy Places and Cultural Heritage.
Well, good evening to everybody, and thank you for inviting me to this meeting. I think I have some slides. I need to do something. Yes, perfect. Thank you. I think that to understand the Vatican policy on Jerusalem, we should start from the double nature of the Vatican, which is at the same time a political and a religious actor. And this makes a difference because, for example, the Vatican has relations with states, and this is the political side, but the Vatican has relations also with other religions, and this is the religious side of the Vatican activity. Now, coming to the Vatican policy concerning Jerusalem, in my opinion, the political dimension is captured by the dialectics between sick and sin political solutions. What do I mean with this? For example, making Jerusalem a corpus separatum, that is, making Jerusalem a body with a territorial internationalization is a sick solution, political solution, because it implies a territory, a government, a police, a citizenship, etc., etc. Advocating a special statute for Jerusalem is a sin political proposal, because you don't need the government, the police, just a few obligations undertaken by some states or international organizations. Then there is the second dimension, the religious dimension, and here, in my opinion, the significant dialectics is between exclusion and inclusion. Exclusion means that the political solution proposed by the Holy See, by the Vatican, is grounded on an exclusively Christian base. So the political solution is based only on a reference to Christianity, while an inclusive dimension means that the political solution for Jerusalem is based on a ground that includes also other religions, not only the Christian religion. Now, we can start examining the Vatican policy on Jerusalem, applying these two dimensions, these two lines. And the starting point of the Jerusalem policy of the Vatican is both sick and exclusive. Sick because in 48-49, the proposal supported by the Vatican was making Jerusalem a corpus separatum. And exclusive because this proposal was predicated exclusively on the Christian memorials that Jerusalem contained. In 48 and in 49, the Pope was then Pius XII, published two encyclicals, encyclical is the most important document in which the Pope expresses his opinion on a subject. And in both encyclicals, there is no reference to the significance of Jerusalem for Jews and Muslims. The topic is Jerusalem is important for Christians. The idea is Jerusalem must be internationalized because it has a universal significance. The universal significance of Jerusalem is that Jesus Christ died for the whole mankind. Stop. That was the reasoning behind this first step. Then we have a second step, and the second step takes shape in 1967 after the Six-Day War. The Vatican understands that making Jerusalem a corpus separatum is no more tenable, is not a feasible proposal anymore, and therefore drops this proposal and replaces it with the proposal of an internationally guaranteed statute of Jerusalem, which is a much thinner proposal. No borders, no police, no governor, etc., just a document approved by a number of states or international organizations with some obligations and some rights concerning Jerusalem. But there is a second new element that takes shapes after the 76. And the second element is that the need of an internationally guaranteed statute is grounded on the historic and religious personality of Jerusalem. I am quoting, a city that enshrines the holy places considered as such by the three great monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. I'm quoting from a speech of Pope Paul VI, and here you see the reference is no more just to Christianity, but the reference is to the significance of Jerusalem to the three monotheistic religions. So the solution, the proposal of the international guaranteed statute of Jerusalem is not only politically thinner, but it is also religiously more inclusive than the previous proposal. Then we come to the third step. We do not have here a definite starting point. Let's say it's a process. This process started grosso modo at the beginning of this century. And the new element here is the dropping of the reference to an internationally guaranteed statute. Starting from 2000, more or less, the mention of an internationally guaranteed statute for Jerusalem becomes more and more infrequent in the Vatican declarations, and the Pope and the Vatican officials limit themselves to asking for a special statute for Jerusalem. No more an internationally guaranteed, just a special statute of Jerusalem. And for example, even when Trump decided to move the embassy, or even when Israel enacted the basic law, Israel as the nation state of Jewish people, where there is the mention of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, the Vatican did not mention the need of an internationally guaranteed statute, but, for example, mentioned only the need of a special statute that grants the spiritual dimension and multi-religious character of the city. I'm quoting from the Pope Francis' speech at the meeting with the King of Morocco a few months ago. So, a much thinner and a much more inclusive proposal. What is going to happen? Nobody knows what is going to happen. It's a guess. My guess is, but it is a guess. So my guess is that in the next year it is likely that even the claim for a special statute will be dropped, and it will be replaced with three demands, with three requests. First, provisions concerning the holy places of Jerusalem, right of access, management of the holy places according to the status quo, provisions regarding the rights and freedom of the Catholic community in Jerusalem, or what is left of the Catholic community of Jerusalem, and rights and freedom of the church institutions, and a third request, the right to freedom of religion for all believers, not only Christians, but believers of every faith. And the new element is that these demands, these requests, are granted through bilateral agreements between the Vatican on the one hand, Israel and the Palestine state on the other hand. So the international community is no more directly involved in the process. It's a bilateral relation between the Vatican and the stakeholders in that region that is replacing the idea of a special statute for Jerusalem. At the end of this process, the situation of Jerusalem will be completely, let's say, normalized, following a pattern that had already been followed for another sacred city, Rome. This is, in my opinion, these are the steps of the Vatican policy. Let me conclude with a tentative assessment of this policy of the Vatican on Jerusalem, about Jerusalem. On the one hand, I think it can be considered as a matter of realpolitik. Basically, the Vatican came to the conclusion that international organizations, be they the United Nations or the European Union, are not able to provide a solution to the Jerusalem issue. Therefore, it is better to rely on bilateral relations with the powers of the region. of the region. On the other hand, the Vatican policy can be seen as a matter of adopting a more spiritual approach to the Jerusalem question. This is an approach which is dear to the actual Pope, to Pope Francis, who seems to be less interested in the political and institutional profiles of the issue of Jerusalem, and more interested, more focused on the religious dimension of the Jerusalem issue. And here is where, in my opinion, the Vatican's policy, and more generally the policy of all the religious actors involved in this area, this is the area where this policy is most questionable. Because the religious community and their leaders have not been able to transform Jerusalem in a place of inter-religious dialogue and harmony. And therefore, they do not have the moral standard to ask states and international organizations for a political and legal status of Jerusalem that reflects the religious significance of the city. My final point is states and international organizations could ask religious community and their leaders, what have you done to make Jerusalem a living model for inter-religious cooperation? And today this question remains without a convincing answer, in my opinion. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we move to Victor. Oh, yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Good afternoon. Just want to check this works. Yeah. So my presentation today is based on a paper which is still a work in progress. I've been working on it for quite some time. It's a paper on Jordan's special role or custodianship in the Muslim holy shrines in Jerusalem, and it's based on interviews. As I shall explain, this special role is defined in the peace treaty between Israel and Jordan, and the paper is based on 2 trips I made to Israel and Jordan and Palestine, where I met with some of the key negotiators of the peace treaty and something called the Washington Declaration. I've also had recourse to some archival documents in the British archives and Israeli archives, as well as open source work on the Ottoman role in Jerusalem. As I said, it's a work in progress, so as I go along, or after you've heard what I've said, if any of you have any thoughts about key texts or if I've missed or issues I could address, I'd appreciate that in the question and answer. So my argument in a nutshell is that Jordan is today fulfilling the role that the Ottoman sultans had once assumed as protectors of the holy places in Jerusalem. So in order to understand this, and one of the key historical moments, which I think is underappreciated, is that the fall of the Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War resulted in a situation where Jerusalem was placed under the control of a non-Muslim power that was then the United Kingdom for the first time in over 1,000 years. And prior to that, the situation was that the Sultan not only acted as a protector of the Muslim holy shrines, but also the Christian and Jewish holy places. There were various treaties with different Christian powers over the Christian holy places, but of course there'd never been a need to protect the Muslim holy places for obvious reasons, because the Ottoman Empire was a Muslim power and the sultans had undertaken that role. But of course this changed after Great Britain was a mandatory power, and then after 1967. So what I will be looking at, so what I'll do is I will start looking at as a lawyer would, looking at the text of the peace treaty and trying to unpack what it means. But I also want to bear in mind this timeline and to consider some of the key dates, especially the period where Jordan controlled the old city of Jerusalem between 1948 and 1967, and then what happened subsequently when Israel recognized Jordan's role as its special role administering the Waqf in the holy places in Jerusalem. So that kind of gives you a timeline. So you can see that even after 1988, when Jordan renounced its claim to the West Bank, it continued to maintain the custodianship. This then found expression in 1994 in the peace treaty, and then more recently in 2013, there's a treaty between Jordan and Palestine, which actually defines what that special role is. So the starting place to understand the origins of this phrase, which I'll show shortly in the peace treaty, is something called the Washington Declaration, which preceded the peace treaty. And in that declaration, there is a specific provision on Jordan's special role in the holy shrines. And this treaty, so this is obviously a photograph of the late King Hussein and the late Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin. And according to interviews, this actual provision in the peace treaty was insisted upon by King Hussein. And it was primarily negotiated between King Hussein and Rabin. Of course, they had advisors, but my understanding is the advisors were not able to that the agreement had been reached, and then you could only tinker with the language. But this was something that was directly agreed to between the Prime Minister and the King. So it was considered, really something quite important. And in fact, one of the negotiators I spoke to in Jordan actually suggested that, and I don't know if this is true, but I'd be interested to know that one of the reasons for Rabin's assassination was precisely because of this clause in the peace treaty. I see you're shaking your head, because it assumes that Jordan has control over also one of the most holy places for Jews. Okay, so let's have a look at what the provision actually says in the peace treaty. It says, Israel respects the present special role of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan in Muslim holy shrines in Jerusalem. And when negotiations on the permanent status will take place, Israel will give high priority to the Jordanian historic role in these shrines. So a few words kind of pop up. One is, what does respect mean? Secondly, what was the present special role of Jordan in the Muslim holy shrines? Another question is, what are Muslim holy shrines? It's in plural. Presumably it's more than Al-Haram al-Sharif. And then another question is, what's the historic role in these shrines? So the initial negotiators of the Washington Declaration was Ali Shukri, who was an aide to King Hussein, and Ephraim Halavi, who was then the deputy head of the Mossad. So you have to recall that Israel and Jordan didn't have formal diplomatic relations before the peace treaty in 1994. So a lot of the relationship went through the security services. So according to Ephraim Halavi's book, the original draft that was presented to Israel by King Hussein, this is from his book called Man in the Shadows, used the following language. So the two countries reconfirm the historic responsibilities of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan in the Islamic holy place in Jerusalem, and then they reaffirm their commitment to render the city a city of peace and hope for all believers. So you notice here it speaks of the historic responsibilities, and it speaks of the Islamic holy place in the singular. And so it becomes evident there that King Hussein's primary objective was Al-Haram al-Sharif, Temple Mount. Now, of course, between these negotiations, the lawyers got involved. So this is a picture of Aoun al-Khassani, who was the legal advisor to the government of Jordan at the time. Later, he was a judge at the International Court of Justice and briefly Prime Minister, who I interviewed. And on the Israeli side, it was Eliakim Rubinstein. I think he was Attorney General at one point, and then I think he just retired as a judge of the Israel Supreme Court. So I interviewed both these gentlemen. And I think it's also helpful to have a direct comparison between the two texts. It helps us to see what the differences were. And so in the paper, I try to unpack what the final draft might mean by looking at what the original draft had said. I'm still stuck on what respect might mean, so I'm still working on that. But you can see it mentions a present special role of the Hashemite kingdom. So that to me means the role that Jordan had in administering the Muslim holy shrines on the date of the Washington Declaration, so in 1994. To me, Muslim holy shrines in the plural means all the Muslim holy shrines in Jerusalem, if you read it literally, not just Al-Haram al-Sharif. So, and also the Waqf have properties outside the old city, in Salahuddin Street and other parts. But it doesn't completely exclude the historic role, although that's mentioned in the context of permanent status negotiations. So let's turn to what might be the meaning of Muslim holy shrines. So again, there's no definition in the peace treaty, but we do have a treaty that was concluded in 2013 between Jordan and Palestine. So this was right after Palestine was given an observer status in the United Nations, which a lot of people kind of dismissed it, but actually it did allow Palestine to do certain things, and one of those things that it allowed it to do was to conclude treaties. So this is one of the first things they did. And the treaty has a definition of Al-Haram al-Sharif, and it defines it as follows. I won't read it out because you can read it, but basically in a nutshell it defines the entire compound as part of the Al-Haram, 144 dunams, which includes all mosques, buildings, walls, courtyards, areas over and beneath the ground. So not just, if you like, the idea that a shrine might be the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, but everything that's inside the walls of the compound. However, as you know, it's not so straightforward, because one of those walls is also holy to the Jewish people. It's the Western or Wailing Wall. According to the Waqf, the actual property ownership of the Western Wall belongs to them. However, for a long time now, there's an established custom for Jews to have unimpeded access to the wall to pray. So we've got to distinguish ownership from praying at a site. But it gets complicated because this photograph's quite good because it shows you the Western Wall, but it also shows you the Mughrabi Gate, which is the only access for tourists into the compound. It's called Mughrabi because, just for those of you who don't know, the area in front of the Western Wall used to be known as the Mughrabi Quarter. It was where, Noor, did you raise that? One of you raised it earlier today. The Mughrabi Quarter was where North African pilgrims used to be housed. Anyhow, one of the arguments that began over the meaning of Article 9 between Israel and Jordan was what did respect mean, and what's the extent of the compound? Where does the beginning? Where does it start? Where does it end? Does access to the compound only begin at the gate, or does it include, entering this corridor, this ramp that has been built to go inside the compound? The Jordanian argument was it included access. The Israeli argument says no, it only begins at the actual compound itself, the wall. I think in the end Israel relented to the Jordanian argument in that regard. But there are still all kinds of issues about architecture, about allowing Jordanian Waqf personnel to enter, about supervision of restoration of various repairs that have to be undertaken inside the compound. Okay, we take a closer look at the peace treaty. We can find that there's a definition of Jordan's special role in Article 2, Again, I won't read it out in the sake of time, but in a nutshell, it mentions freedom of worship, administration and maintenance of the shrines, representation of the holy place in international forums, and management of the institution of Waqf. It also says it will assert the respect, but again, we don't know what respect means, so that's something I'm trying to come up with by looking at other analogies. So the last slides I'll do is what I'm going to try to argue is that despite this treaty in 94 and this treaty in 2013, actually there is a precedent for what Jordan is trying to assert. There was a practice that pre-existed Jordan's occupation of Jerusalem in 1948. And this goes back to the pilgrimage routes from primarily, obviously, to Mecca and Medina. And there was a practice, and again, the practice is scanty, but there is literature to suggest that it was very common for Muslim pilgrims to make visitation to Jerusalem. So visitation is not compulsory, but it was something some pious Muslims did before they went on Hajj or did Umrah. So one of the key texts in this regard is by Soraya Faroqi. It's called Pilgrims and Sultans. However, her focus is not so much on Jerusalem, but on the pilgrimage route and the role of the sultans in protecting the pilgrimage route from Bedouin, in having the right to upkeep the shrines and prevent other Muslim powers from trying to take that role. So if anyone here, because there's lots of experts in the room, can know of any other scholars or experts who have written about this beyond Soraya Faroqi, I'd be very interested to hear from you. And so the argument goes as follows. What happened in 1924 was the abolition of the caliphate by the Turkish National Assembly, by Ataturk. And what happened then is that Sharif Hussein ibn Ali, who was the last Sharif of Mecca, that included the Hijaz, included what is now known as Saudi Arabia, he eventually wanted to be appointed the last caliph. So and this is Joshua Teitelbaum's work, he reached out to the last sultan, who actually traveled to Mecca, to obtain an oath of allegiance from him. However, he was not successful. He didn't get the oath of allegiance. So then and this is also a time when the Saudi family are coming out of Najd and essentially creating the modern state of Saudi Arabia, which results in the Hashemites, if you like, being expelled from the Hijaz, and they end up basically in the Levant, in Iraq, in Syria, and in what is now known as Jordan. And there is evidence a document published by the Royal Institute for Strategic Studies in Amman has photographs of newspaper cuttings showing that, and there's also literature on this in Israel, showing that although the last caliph did not give him the oath of allegiance, Hajj Amin al-Hussein, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, on the left here, did acknowledge Hussein ibn Ali as the last Khalifa of all Muslims, and also agreed that the restoration of Al-Aqsa Mosque would henceforth become the responsibility of the royal Jordanian household. And so the argument is, since 1924, Jordan has been donating funds to maintain the upkeep of the mosque. Again, work is very scanty on, as we've heard from others, including Menachem, on Jordanian Jerusalem between 1948 and 1967. But one of the most useful documents or books I've read is by Kimberly Katz, called Jordanian Jerusalem, and she has a chapter where she looks at the way in which the Hashemite royal family tried to encourage Muslims to continue the pilgrimage to Al-Haram al-Sharif. And this is a picture of King Abdullah, who was assassinated at Al-Aqsa Mosque, and he and his father are buried, in the mosque. So she, again, and King Hussein then appointed a custodian from the Nashashibi family, initially to actually take the day-to-day activities of administering it, and the Waqf came under the central treasury of the royal household. And all the So the role as a Supreme Muslim Council in the British Mandate then was abolished, and a Jordanian body was established in its place. And Mick Dump has written a lot about this in his early work. So essentially, the Jordanian government took over the role of the Waqf, took over the role of protector of Jerusalem, and according to Katz, this was not challenged by any Arab countries at the time. So there were conferences were held in Jerusalem at the time, and no one really protested. They protested Jordan's claim to be sovereign, but they didn't protest Jordan's claim to be the protector of the Muslim holy shrines. So what happened in 1967 when Israel captured the old city? Initially, some soldiers actually hung the Star of David, the flag of Israel, the national flag for Israel, on top of the dome of the rock, which you can see here. But very shortly after that, the Minister of Defense, Moshe Dayan, ordered them to pull it down. And after some discussions, a dispute was the Waqf, they decided to maintain what they call the status quo. In other words, which is not to be confused with the status quo of the Christian holy places, but basically they would continue, they would recognize the role of the Jordanian government in paying the employees of the Waqf to secure inside the shrine, not outside, to maintain the shrine, and that more or less continued until the peace treaty of 1994. So the argument is the present special role is this precedent, if you like. However, since then, there have been all kinds of disputes since 2000. Restrictions have been placed on the as I mentioned, on access to the shrine. Just to show you a picture of the Waqf today. So this is the head of the Jordanian Waqf was Prince William, visiting last year. And so he has an office right at one of the entrances to the Haram al-Sharif Temple Mount. So to conclude, it seems to me that the evidence is a bit scanty, but there is evidence to show that there was a local practice, or what you might call a regional custom, between Israel and Jordan between 1967 to 1994. And this has been defined in the Article 9 of the Peace Treaty and in the treaty between Jordan and Palestine more recently. But questions remain. What does respect mean? So what did Israel respect, and what is the extent of that respect? Can Israel block access to Jordanian personnel? To what extent can Jordan, push back against that? When does Israel cease respecting Jordan's role, shall we say? And then the other question, of course, where does a special role begin and end? Is it the facade of the building? Is it physical access to the building? So yeah, I'll leave it there. But as I said, it's a work in progress, so I'm happy to hear from you. Thank you.
Okay. Hello? Yes. Is it working? I don't think it is.
Do you want to use this one?
Sorry. Thank you. Hi. Right. Now, Dominique?
Yes. I do also the drum, and but you don't hear me. I feel you hear me. So normally I've got one slide. I don't know if we've got it. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. And this is it. And I'm going to come back to it at the very end of this expose, and I remained also by the adjective spatial, because I titled my intervention "France and Jerusalem: A Spatial Relationship." I'm going to try to make this very long story short, and I hope that I'm going to keep my time. The spatial relationship of France to Jerusalem up to nowadays bases on the Crusades and their memory. From the 16th century onwards, through the so-called capitulations, France showed interest in a privileged position in the Ottoman Empire, especially in Jerusalem, next to the holy places. Interest, and got indeed this status of a puissance protectrice des Latins, protecting power of the Catholics, with the right to protect first Catholic foreign residents and afterwards, by extension, also Latin citizens of the Ottoman Empire, meaning Catholic or members of churches united to Rome. At the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the following century, France participated in the so-called rediscovery of Palestine or the invention of the Holy Land. This was a romantic move, a strong religious revival, and finally, a political interest. In 1843, France established a consulate in Jerusalem. Though the French office was not the first European representation to be opened in the Holy City, the British and the Prussians having achieved this step before, France was among the first, above all, before the very aggressive Russians. The French representative became the interlocutor for Ottoman local authorities in connection with the French ambassador to the port based in Constantinople. The Holy See not enjoying diplomatic relations to the Ottoman Empire, France also represented its interests. French consuls from then on, mostly convinced Catholics, intervened for Catholic foreigners, mostly religious people, which number began to increase quickly. France had to deal with people of any origin when they came into conflict with the Ottoman authorities or Ottoman citizens. The French consul also had to deal with conflicts among Catholics themselves. We have from then on the establishment of a vast network of religious institutions in Jerusalem, the Holy Land, and throughout the Ottoman Empire. From the 1840s onwards, until the very beginning of the 20th century, many communities came to Jerusalem and decided to stay. France enjoyed a full cooperation by the religious communities in agreement with the Latin Patriarchate and the Holy See. And this was of big help indeed, because it was, for France, for Paris, a cheap way to disseminate in Jerusalem and Palestine the French mission civilisatrice. And maybe you know that it's very important to us to disseminate this mission civilisatrice. For the communities, it was also a way for the religious communities, for the French religious communities coming to the Holy City, it was also a way to escape the difficult situation due to the rising French anti-clericalism, which became law with the 1880s measures taken against the religious orders. And this leads to what we described, what we mentioned already this morning, to a very paradoxical situation. Official France persecuted religious people inside her borders, but helped the same people settling abroad, even using them as auxiliaries for her own foreign policy. On their side, the religious people acted benevolently as Catholics, but also as convinced French patriots in a time of rising nationalisms in Europe. New crusaders, they established schools for kids, orphanages, dispensaries and hospitals, agricultural schools. They also established own seminaries in Jerusalem, seminaries also for Oriental clerics, or they established institutes of higher education like the Dominicans of the famous École Biblique. They also constructed huge buildings, and the French flag marked the growing French presence. And this conducted to a de facto conquest with vast buildings marking the landscape, some of them constituting at the end of the 19th century what the French called the French Quarter, immediately outside the new gate. These religious communities enjoyed a due support by the French consul, whose presence regularly was noted on the very French occasions, for instance, on the 14th of July. Within, and this was the case at the time, within French churches where the consul was, so to say, at home, but it also was the case within international churches, I would call them like that, like the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem and the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. Beyond the communities, and I know you are particularly interested in, France obtained also in this time the so-called national domains. From 1856 onwards, 4 plots were given to France and became French territories with extraterritorial status. 3 religious communities were installed in the 3 Catholic sites among the 4 and still are there. The last site being an archaeological excavation of Jewish origin called Tombeau des Rois, or Tomb of the Kings. Keepers of the French properties, these communities were made of very French representatives on plots with which French status lasts until this very day. All in all, French memory places, lieux de mémoire, and places of life, lieux de vie, in Jerusalem became there very present, with permanent French residents partly settling on former, and I think my mic is over, partly settling on former Crusaders' places. The status was definitely de jure ensured at the very beginning of the 20th century with the Mytilene Agreement of 1901 and afterwards with the Constantinople Arrangement of 1913. A solid ground was established to what appeared as a long-lasting connection to Jerusalem few years after the confirmation by the Holy See of the French prevalence among the Catholic powers. Beside these permanent French representations, we also have French, and this was also mentioned before, French pilgrimages, numbering each hundreds of pilgrims making their way to Jerusalem from especially 1882 onwards, and which established a direct connection to the ancient French past in the area, calling themselves Pacific Crusades. The prevalent French position never was accepted by the main rivals. The British, interested by a region close to Egypt, the Russians showing themselves as successors of Byzance, and the Prussians, and then Germans, newcomers present via Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish interests, and advancing themselves as partners of the Ottomans. World War I meant the end of the French Golden Age in Jerusalem. The Ottoman Empire unilaterally made an end to the capitulations, ending 4 centuries of French privilege position. The French consul general had to leave Jerusalem. French religious people were arrested and expelled. The French institutions were closed or occupied by the Ottoman army or religious people from Germany or Austria-Hungary. The French dream of the restoration of the Latin kingdoms definitely seemed over. But in the same time, during World War I, we have a revival of such ideas. Beside Sykes-Picot, the restoration of the French predominance at the holy places became topic of many speeches, publications, and thoughts by both politicians and clerics, all placed under the motto of Dieu le veut, God wills it, that we come back, indeed. The fight against the Turks and their contemplated defeat should lead to the establishment of a greater Syria, including Palestine and Jerusalem under French rule, of course. All local populations would welcome such a destiny, like Maurice Barrès, who wrote at the time, "We possess the souls of the Orientals." So we are indeed the destiny of this area, we, the French. The reality, again, paved the way of the realization of such plans with many obstacles. Great Britain rejected any foreign pretension on the territory, especially the French ones. London made it difficult for the French people who wanted to come back to their former places to get to Jerusalem. Even after World War I, even the Holy See had to reconsider the French position in Jerusalem. After the capitulations had been revoked by the Ottomans, their restoration and the restoration of the French protectorate seemed superfluous since Christians had not to be protected against anybody anymore. The international treaties confirmed the new situations. The peace treaties with Turkey, San Remo in 1920 and Lausanne in 1923, confirmed the end of the capitulations and so the end of the specific role of France. France then had to do with a new Palestine, with Jerusalem as capital of the mandate, engage in a new destiny with the Balfour Declaration integrated in the mandate charter. There was a brief period of hopes in the years 1917-1920, but the following years were marked with disillusions regarding French ambitions and pretensions. During the negotiations on the mandate charter, a Commission des lieux saints, Commission for Holy Places, was contemplated. France tried to obtain the chairmanship of this new body, but did not get the position. France was also affected by the late consequences of her own policy against religious orders and congregations. While acting against them, she had limited their recruitment, with the result of having less people to be sent abroad and to occupy the institutions. Rejecting any Jewish fate for Palestine, France was able to have, though, her religious allies investing against their institutions in a new context where Hebrew, Arabic and English were the official languages. France had the possibility to get that there was no modification to the specific tax status of the institutions, allowing a continued activity of the religious institutions, and so the French presence within the mandate educational system. France was also able to preserve, in a way, the traditional position of her representative in Jerusalem. After the restoration of diplomatic relations with the Holy See, France had to accept the Vatican's point of view regarding the end of the French protectorate, but her wish to have the French Consul General further honored by the Catholic Church was satisfied with the 1926 so-called liturgical honors, honneurs liturgiques, showing specific respect to the French Consul General. And indeed, there was a possibility for him to enjoy further some rights and privileges within the Holy Sepulchre, but specifically within the French churches in Jerusalem. Also in this mandate period, the 4 national domains remained untouched, and the French flag was still waving on many places in Jerusalem. France, nevertheless, progressively had to adapt to the new state of things and to present new sides. France had so to address the new challenges and new potential clients of the French mission civilisatrice. The growing Jewish population was, for instance, addressed by a Center for French Culture, established in 1937, in the very heart of the growing Jewish part of Jerusalem. A chair for French culture was also established at the Hebrew University from 1938 onwards with French funds. And there was also the creation of a French cultural center in the Arab side of the city. In the 1930s, we have also, and this is a very symbolic gesture, the opening, after many decades of precarious locations, of a building per se for the French Consulate General. Now we go in a rush towards the current state of things. World War II and its consequences meant a new upheaval for the French position in Jerusalem. The immediate afterwar troubles were seen by some Frenchmen as a possibility to reshuffle the cards and to gain a prevalent position again. For instance, the Consul General René Neuville, a very conservative and Catholic personality, thought that the beginning of a new era could be a possibility to finally reach what had been missed in 1917-1922. The spatial status contemplated for Jerusalem, the famous corpus separatum we just heard about, with this international status, seemed a unique possibility to have France getting back to her previous privileged position. But, as we know it, the dramatic evolution of Palestine brought again this dream to a quick end. The new state, Israel, was recognized by France with some delay, but attached to the traditional status of Jerusalem and her own position there, France had to accept the new context. France obtained from Israel the recognition of the specific status of French Catholic institutions established in the western part of Jerusalem, especially their tax exemptions in 1949, and France went on rejecting any fait accompli, which should prevent later more positive evolutions. France, by the way, rejected, for instance, the Israeli designation of the western part of the Holy City as capital of Israel. But France, nevertheless, had to do with the state of things. Some French institutions and interests had been damaged or even destroyed by the conflict. The French Consulate General was also under attack and had been damaged in the heavy fights taking place at the limits between both parts of the city. Some institutions were divided between both parts of the city, like the establishment of the Assumptionists. Some others had to end or relocate their activities. Once again, France adapted. The French consul in Jerusalem was able to maintain French habits in the city. He became competent for the entire Jerusalem, crossing the new international borders between Israel and Jordan, and being autonomous of the new French embassy established in Tel Aviv. René Neuville, once again, the French consul general, illustrates until the very end of his own life this new dimension. Having died in 1952 at the French Consulate General, then in West Jerusalem, his body was driven through Mandelbaum Gate, and his funerals took place at the French Church and French National Domain of Sainte Anne, then in East Jerusalem, where he is still buried. The 6 Days War in 1967, yes, drove to a new situation, potentially less favorable to the French point of view. With a military conquest and annexation, the situation of the French institutions became, in a way, easier with the disappearance of hermetic international borders dividing the Holy City. For France, it was important to put again the rejection of the Israeli claim, having Jerusalem as capital now expanded to the entire city. France had from then on to confront national Israeli claims and the day-to-day contact with the local municipality, with the Jewish mayor in charge of the entire city. France could maintain her symbolic positions. Today, only few of the French institutions founded between the 1840s and the beginning of the 20th century have disappeared. The Israeli administration generally respects the commitment of the early state of Israel regarding the tax exemptions, for instance. The French Consul General today still enjoys the liturgical honors inaugurated in the 1920s. The French Consulate General in Jerusalem includes today an employee specifically in charge of the management of the French Catholic institutions. Nowadays, it's a Jesuit father, a salaried employee of the French Republic, which is maybe a contradiction for you, but not for France in Jerusalem. France is still willing, with her European partners, to play a role toward the new international actor which appeared in 1994, the Palestinian Authority. Since I was shown that my time is up, I'm going to make my conclusion and make my concluding lines. In insisting on the fact that France indeed remains today sensitive to each damage to her specific status in Jerusalem. This was shown, for instance, by the incidents during a state visit of President Jacques Chirac in 1997. Maybe afterwards I have the opportunity to come back to it. What remains today? The French preoccupation for Jerusalem relies on the facts I have established above. In the last years, the memory and the reality of a specific relation to Jerusalem are part of a new sensitivity to the fate of the Oriental Christians. With the Arab Springs, the French tradition has been revived. The current preoccupation of French diplomacy aims at the maintaining of the French Catholic institutions and of their status, as well as a continued Christian life next to the holy places of Christianity. The French lay republic remains preoccupied by her Catholic status in the Holy City. France, as Catholic power, has still to act to defend her specific relation to Jerusalem. As a matter of fact, French institutions are regularly under threat of cancellation of their privileges. French positions are threatened by the very action of the Holy See, aiming at normalizing her relations with Israel. But then we have also and very new threats from ultra-Orthodox settler circles aiming at the status of the tomb of the kings, and I'm not going to go deeper on it today, at this moment. The French spatial relation to Jerusalem leads today to the continued refusal of any change in the status quo of the city of Jerusalem, even if the nowadays context has considerably changed since the relation has begun. Thank you very much.
Right. Well, thank you very much to all the four presenters. And we're going to open discussions to the floor. But before that, can I just sort of like give, as somebody who is obviously interested in quite a lot of universal themes that's been raised, although I am not at all a specialist on Jerusalem or of the Middle East, I'm really struck by, so please forgive me if my comments seem very naive somewhat, but I'm very struck by this kind of notion of all these, the four papers today, I mean, just in this panel, pretty much about how to continue to hold influence in the respective spaces which had been, or which each of these countries claim to hold. And so I think Professor Ferrari's point about this kind of intersection between political and religious kind of elements, and to what extent one kind of influences the other, I really liked your kind of diagram, because to me it really made it sort of very comprehensible what was happening. The minute you release or you're willing to share influence, then effectively you're actually moving away from this thick and exclusive part. You just become more inclusive, and it goes on the thin end, right? So this kind of idea of like, although I actually kind of had a very limited understanding of this old city and Jerusalem, in generally speaking, just due ignorance. But I thought it was more to do with religions. But to me, just listening to all these places, it's like very, very, very political, right? And it's like, so what is the relationship between this kind of political and the religious? Maybe it's very difficult to separate the two. Because they're so intertwined, depending on the different contexts context in which your papers were given, but this kind of spatial notion of politics, and whether it's something that historical geographers, for example, work on it, because I think it might be quite an interesting way if the field hasn't been opened up to kind of much more kind of spatial analysis of politics and religions and history. There might be quite an interesting thing, yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the differences between, all the papers on this panel, we're talking about sovereign actors,
Exactly.
which is slightly different to say Protestant churches or other communities. They don't have a state protector that's behind them and that's driving it forward. So I think that's a distinction. I think that that's what we have in common of all the papers, definitely
papers,
there. And I think that makes it, the difference in terms of their power to act as actors at the United Nations or sign treaties with states and their history, involvement in this city. So you absolutely agree with what you've said.
Okay, yes, sorry for hogging. Please, any questions? Yes.
It's not really a question, but Victor, when you mentioned the possibility, at least, that Hajj Amin Husseini, the head of the Muslim Council in Jerusalem, acknowledging the special role of, by then it was King Hussein, Sharif Hussein of Mecca. And of course, as we discussed outside, I've never heard of that, but it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But I'm curious about 1924. Because that is the time period when the Sharif Hussein lost control of Hijaz. So was this attempt by the Sharif Hussein to become the caliph, was this a post-defeat in the Hijaz in Arabia, or it's just not connected?
It was just before the defeat. I think because the defeat was 24-25, I think. So just before, but he probably knew he was losing control then,
Any more? Yes.
Thank you. I also have a question for Victor, actually. The 2013 agreement between Palestine and Jordan makes reference to all the waqf which is related to Masjid al-Aqsa, which is, I think, what was on the first slide. Now that's really enormous. So many parts of the city and surrounding villages were vowed to the upkeep of Al-Aqsa that I'm astonished about the wording, because it's really extensive and it goes way beyond the confines of the Haram al-Sharif.
Yes. So when
I just wanted some.
Yeah. So when I interviewed some of the officials in Jordan, for example, they say that back in the 50s, I think one of the Greek Orthodox churches recognized King Hussein's role in the churches, and also the Waqf itself owns a lot of property beyond Al-Haram al-Sharif. And they mixed on a lot of work on the way in which they developed Salahuddin Street into a commercial center and used Waqf money to do that. So, and there were all kind of Sufi lodges or hospices, all kinds of charitable works scattered throughout the old city and probably even in parts of West Jerusalem too. Yeah. Surrounding villages as well. Yeah.
If I may, I meant to ask this. Thank you for mentioning. My understanding also is to this day the king of Jordan has the power also over Christian churches. So whenever the patriarch, particularly of the Greek Orthodox, I have to say.
The RUM, is it? The R-U-M. RUM
Yeah,
Orthodox.
the RUM, exactly.
Orthodox, yes,
which, whenever a new patriarch is appointed, he must be appointed by the king.
Yeah.
And of course, there's a negotiation, the Palestinian Authority is involved in the state of Israel, but the formality it's by the king. But the agreement here is limited to the mosque, basically, or the esplanade of the mosque, but does not include that particular role?
Well, it says the peace treaty, you're correct. It says Muslim holy shrines, but the treaty 2013 is broader than that. But yes, yeah, that's it.
Yes, Michael?
Sorry.
Yeah.
I've got a little anecdote which I think may any of you can comment on, but it's probably more relevant to Professor Ferrari's. And it follows on from your earlier comment, Professor Shimazu. Some years ago, I wrote a paper on the sale of Greek Orthodox Patriarch land to the Israelis, and where they were being as part of the Israeli sort of takeover of the old city. And I presented this paper at a conference in Morocco. And after the conference, the Greek Orthodox, a senior person in the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate came up to me and took me away for a walk around the grounds and explained to me I was not incorrect in the details, but I was very incorrect in my interpretation. And his argument was that, yes, land is being sold, but the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate is thinking in terms of centuries. It's not thinking in terms of surviving for the next few years. It's thinking of its presence over eons, yeah? And the only way it can do that is to not ally itself in any way to what he called trivial nationalisms, Zionism or Palestinian nationalism, because these things come and go, but the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate is going to stay and also retain its precedence, its preeminent position. And I've often thought about that as a different concept of time, different concepts of politics. And in a way, I'm thinking a little bit about the Vatican. Does it have this long-term view as well? And is this scheme that you seem to indicate of a declining authority of the Vatican Church, a declining influence, because it's not able to have a thick and exclusive an arrangement, but it is much more going towards the thin and the inclusive. Is that a tactic because of the current circumstances, or but the preferred goal is something thick and exclusive, but they are playing the game because they want to stay in the game for as long as possible in order to maintain their position? I've got some other questions, but I'll leave that for the time being.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I think that's a wonderful question for the whole panel, including Elena. Are you still there? No, she's okay. Unfortunately, I think she's kind of gone. And I think what Michael said connects with your French example as well. So can I ask? I don't know. Would you like to go first, or yeah?
Well, I think that the Vatican will never explicitly drop the idea of the corpus separatum. You'll never get a declaration, in my opinion, by the Vatican saying, well, we were mistaken, or, we don't want any more Jerusalem as an international city. They just put aside, they just leave this issue unspoken in the territory of the anymore spoken things. And they make other proposals. Probably in the back of the Vatican mind, there is the idea that the corpus separatum in a different setting, in a different situation, can be recovered. And that is why it's better not to leave it to go away forever. but I think that after the Vatican II Council, it would be difficult to start again an exclusionary religious politics on the part of the Vatican. While on the political side of the issue, different options may be open, I think that it would be very difficult. There have been many theological developments concerning Judaism, concerning Islam, etc., that would make very unlikely that any claim of the Vatican on Jerusalem is made on an exclusively Christian base. This is something that, in my opinion, is really changed.
Dominique?
I was thinking, I think also that France, as for now, pushes for an internationally recognized status of Jerusalem, that's for sure. Being corpus separatum or what else, I don't know. But I'm sure that France, and now the French ambassador is not here, so he's not going to contradict me, but I'm sure France fears any normalization of the relations of the Holy See to Israel, going deeper regarding the status of Jerusalem, because it would, by this way, if there is, for instance, the mere establishment and of a list of all Catholic institutions in Jerusalem within a treaty signed by both parties, the Holy See and Israel, this would be a cancellation or a modification of the status quo. And this would be a cancellation of the still specific status of France. Even if today you have seen the French flag on Saint-Vincent-Paul and Saint-Joseph de l'Apparition, etc., etc. These are so-called French institutions with the French flag on it, but within the religious people are everything but not French people. There are English people, English-speaking people, Indonesian nuns, etc., etc., but working within French institutions. So we, France, is very attached to this very specific status, symbolic status. And indeed, if there is a normalization, all of this disappears, and through it also the French situation. So I think in this way, also France think on a very long term, maybe not for centuries or eternity, but on a very long term also.
Victor, would you like to comment as well, or are you okay?
I'm okay.
Are you okay?
I've got a question for Sylvia, but it's probably a bit ask and laugh
Okay.
afterwards.
Would you mind identifying yourself? Sorry. Yeah.
Yes, hi, I'm Mahmoud Humud, the ambassador of Jordan. I just wanted to talk about the peace treaty itself. And the issue is for Victor, the respect wording as such, and whether, how do you essentially interpret it? How I interpret it, and maybe we talked about this before, is in the context of a normative obligation as such, because if you see the wording from human rights treaties and words used by the treaty bodies as such, it is used in the context of adherence to obligations. You see that in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights also. The word respect. So essentially it is
My understanding and the understanding of Jordan is that Israel has to adhere to the special role that Jordan has in the Muslim holy shrines. Now, how we describe the special role? The special role, you have to look at it from the historical context. And you were right when you say, is there some kind of an implicit custom or particular custom, bilateral custom between the two states that was created after 1967 that puts the context of the historical role in perspective. And then you have to look at those functions, the function of internal security in the Haram. That's only about, I'm talking about the Haram. The second thing is with regard to the access, as mentioned, and the third with regard to the issue of maintenance. And they don't come from a vacuum. These are essentially functions that are taken in accordance with, my understanding, what international law provides for not only a government, but the state itself, including the Hague Convention on the protection of cultural property during armed conflict, which provides the role with regard to the cultural and historic places during occupation, and how and who has the authority in this regard. And essentially, when Jerusalem was occupied from Jordan as such, whether it was de jure or de facto, you can describe it. Security Council resolution at one point recognized that it was Jordan territory after the Samoa attack. So these are some elements that you have to take into consideration. But essentially, the issue has to be that it is only the maintenance of the special status that has to be respected under the peace treaty by Israel, and that it should not be changed or degraded by any means. The other thing with regard to the Waqf is, it's not religious property as such. Waqf is more than this. It's a public property by which there is rights in perpetuity, by which, for instance, a certain family, provides the dividends for religious purposes as such. So there is private rights and there is public rights with regard to Waqf. And when it is a religious Waqf, it means that it has special protection under international law. Sorry for being legal a little bit about the issue, but that's how Jordan special role should be described with regard to the holy places. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, Victor, would you like to?
No, that's very helpful. I'm still looking at all these issues. But yeah, no, I think it's very helpful to think of respect as a normative obligation, and I'm going to take a closer look at the Hague Convention on the protection of cultural property as well. Yeah, thank you.
Yes. Oh, 5 minutes, I've been told. Okay, great. Yes.
He wants to get back.
If there is time.
Yes.
And no question.
Yeah.
Yes,
Oh,
there is.
there's one question.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
Yeah. If it's sort of connected,
No problem.
yeah. Okay.
Yeah, sorry, just this is the question I was going to ask Victor earlier. I mean, in all these agreements that you sort of looked at, often in most peace treaties, they are the tip of an iceberg of other understandings which have accumulated, and they are attempts to frame what the situation is, and how to make it more specific, and make the definitions more common. I just wondered what else is going on underneath the water, so to speak. If these agreements are the tip of the iceberg, surely they're based on a whole series of bilateral understandings which have built up over the last 20-odd, 30 years. And in your interviews, did you get any indication what they're supposed to kind of encapsulate without actually being very explicit? That's one part of the question. The other one is, have you looked at the whole inscription of Jerusalem on the World Heritage List? Because Jordan was the sponsor of that. And I just wondered if that gave some precedence in terms of its role and its recognition by the international community as the sponsor of the World Heritage List inscription.
Yeah, I've looked at them, not on UNESCO, not that closely, but maybe I should do that. With regards to all these understandings between Jordan and Israel. Although the interviews were useful, but there was people who had got involved in this issue more recent years. I haven't been able to find anyone who could really explain to me in detail what the relationship was before 1994. And also, I don't know if there were any written, or whether it was just a practice. I don't know if there were any documents. I wouldn't know where to find them, or whether those kind of understandings are available. Yeah, unfortunately. Yeah, I did ask, but yeah, even the things like the negotiation documents, I don't think there were any taken, or if they are, we don't know where they are. So,
okay, I think before we end, I'd like to give Dominique the opportunity to get back to some of the issues. Yeah.
I just wanted, would it be possible to show again the picture I had behind me? Because we still have some more minutes, and I want, maybe you recognize the former French President François Hollande. Thank you very much. And this is an interesting picture because you see him going out of St. Anne Church in East Jerusalem, in the old city next to the Lion's Gate. And this is a French national domain, meaning it's a Crusader church, but it's now part of France because it has been given by the Ottoman Empire to France in 1856, because France helped the Ottoman Empire against the Russians. So as a compensation, as a gesture of thanks, it was given to France. And now what is also quite interesting is the president of a very laïc French Republic is going out of the church accompanied by a religious guy. This is Franz Bowen, a Belgian, a white father, and the white fathers are now holding since 1882 they are the community inside the St. Anne Church, which is also quite interesting of the picture I'm going to stand. This is the then French Consul General. So, and now it's quite okay because it's in East Jerusalem. So in Jerusalem, so he has to conduct the French president. But also on this picture, what is quite interesting is that you have the president of the Mission Laïque Française, the French lay mission. It is maybe nothing for you, but it's a very lay educational system organized at the very anti-clerical period in France. And he was an ambassador, a French ambassador, and he's then representing the very lay France, but he was part of this delegation, and he entered also the church. So in Jerusalem, everything is possible, I would say. It's politics. Back to history, St. Anne Church, after the fall of the Latin Kingdom, has been used by the Ottomans, so after in the 16th century, has been used as a madrasa. And you see above the door, you still see a plaque with an Ottoman inscription telling about the situation of the church as a madrasa. And the plaque has been kept untouched by the French Republic, also if the church has been restored. But don't forget, this is a French place, a French territory, a French piece of territory in East Jerusalem, one of the 4 national domains. That's it. Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry?
It was also
Before the
As a madrasa.
yeah. Well, I mean, as a historian, I'm very pleased that history is so significant. Anyway, thank you so much to the panelists and to the audience for a most excellent and stimulating session.